The carriage overturned with a sound like thunder against stone. For a moment the world seemed to split apart. Wood shattered. Horses screamed. Dust rose into the air like smoke from a battlefield. Then everything went still. Inside the broken carriage, Lydia Foster could not move. The coach had rolled halfway down a rocky slope, its heavy body trapped against loose earth and jagged stones that shifted with every faint creak of wood. One wrong movement and the entire wreck would plunge the rest of the way down the ravine. Lydia opened her eyes slowly. Pain greeted her instantly. It spread through her ribs, her shoulders, and most terrifying of all, deep within her belly where both her hands clutched instinctively. Her child. A weak breath escaped her lips. "Please," she whispered, though she was not certain whether she spoke to God or to the small life she carried. Dust floated through a narrow beam of sunlight cutting through the shattered wall of the coach. Broken benches pinned the lower half of her dress, trapping her in place like a prisoner. She tried to shift. The carriage groaned. Loose stones slid beneath the wheels. Lydia froze. Her heart pounded so violently she thought it might shake the entire structure apart. Around her lay the terrible silence that follows disaster. No voices, no movement, no help. Only the creaking skeleton of the carriage and the distant cry of frightened horses somewhere beyond the slope. For the first time since the accident, fear tightened fully around her chest. Not fear for herself. Fear for the baby. Her fingers pressed harder over the curve of her stomach. "Hold on," she whispered weakly. "Just a little longer." Then footsteps. Faint at first. Male voices carried down the hillside above the wreck. Lydia turned her head toward the light. A tall silhouette appeared at the edge of the slope. He descended slowly, carefully, as though he had already calculated every step before placing his boot upon the shifting ground. Behind him, two men followed more cautiously.
"Sir!" one of them called sharply. "The ground is unstable!"
The tall man did not stop. Even from where she lay trapped, Lydia could sense the calm authority in his movements. He reached the broken carriage and looked inside. For one brief moment, the world narrowed to the meeting of two strangers' eyes. His were pale, cold, and startlingly steady. He was not dressed like a miner or a traveler of the frontier. His dark coat, though dusty from the climb, was tailored, the cut unmistakably European. A gentleman. No, something more. He looked at the wreckage once, quickly assessing the broken structure. Then his gaze returned to Lydia, not to her face, to her hands clutching her belly. Understanding flashed across his expression. "You are injured," he said. His voice carried a faint foreign cadence. Measured, precise. Lydia tried to answer. Nothing came. Her throat burned from dust. The man studied the fractured beams holding the carriage in place. His eyes moved with unsettling speed, calculating the danger. Above them, one of his companions shouted again, "Sir, if that frame shifts—" The stranger ignored him. Instead, he crouched beside the cracked wall of the coach. "Can you move your legs?" he asked Lydia. She tried. The trapped fabric pulled tight against splintered wood. She shook her head. "No." The word barely escaped. For a moment the man said nothing. He simply looked at the carriage. Then he stood and barked several commands up the hill in a language Lydia did not understand. His companions hesitated. The ground beneath them shifted again. Small rocks slid down the slope. The carriage groaned. Lydia's breath caught. "It will fall," she whispered weakly. The man looked at her again. His expression did not soften, but something in his gaze hardened with quiet resolve. "No," he said calmly. "It will not." Before she could protest, he forced open the shattered side panel of the coach. The wood cracked loudly. Dust rained down. The entire wreck shifted a fraction. Lydia gasped. But the man climbed inside. The cramped space forced him to kneel beside her. He moved with deliberate care, avoiding the beams pinning her dress. Up close she could see the sharp lines of his face, a soldier's composure, a nobleman's restraint, and eyes that did not seem accustomed to failing. "Listen to me," he said quietly. "I will lift you. When I do, place your arm around my shoulder." Her heart pounded. "What if it collapses?" He slid one arm beneath her back. The other braced the beam above her head. Then he met her gaze. For the first time his voice carried something almost human beneath the control. "Then we move faster." He lifted. Pain exploded through Lydia's body. Her dress tore against the broken wood. She bit her lip hard enough to draw blood. The carriage groaned again. Above them someone shouted in alarm. But the stranger did not hesitate. He freed her from the wreckage with a final pull and lifted her into his arms. Then he climbed out. 2 strides. 3. The moment his boots touched solid ground, the carriage shifted violently behind them. A wheel slipped. Rocks thundered down the slope. The wreck slid several feet before catching again against the earth. But Lydia was already safe. The stranger laid her carefully upon the dry ground far from the edge. Only then did he allow himself to breathe. Lydia looked up at him through blurred vision. Dust clung to his dark hair. His coat was torn at the sleeve, but he stood tall, composed, as though defying death were merely an inconvenience. Tears slipped from the corners of her eyes. "You came back," she whispered. The man studied her quietly. Then he extended his hand. "What is your name?" "Lydia," she breathed. "Lydia Foster." He nodded once. "Henrik Leuven." His gaze flicked briefly to the curve of her stomach, and when he spoke again, something in his voice had changed. "We must move," he said. "You are not the only one who nearly died today." The wagon creaked steadily along the narrow road toward San Francisco. Inside, Lydia lay upon a nest of blankets Henrik had arranged himself. Every few minutes the wheels struck a rut in the dry earth, sending a jolt through the carriage. Each time, Henrik's hand moved instinctively to steady the wooden frame above her head. He said nothing, but he watched her carefully. Lydia noticed. She had been watching him as well. Henrik Leuven did not behave like the men she had known in Missouri. Most men talk too much when they wish to appear brave. Henrik spoke rarely. Yet every movement he made carried quiet authority. The two men riding behind the wagon, his companions, obeyed his instructions without question. Even Lars, the tall Scandinavian who clearly knew him well, waited for Henrik's word before doing anything. It unsettled Lydia, not because she feared him, because she could not understand him. "You did not have to do this," she said softly after a long silence. Henrik looked down at her from the bench where he now sat beside her rather than outside with the driver. "Do what?" "Rescue a stranger," Lydia murmured. A faint line appeared between his brows. "I did not rescue a stranger." His eyes drifted again to the gentle rise of her stomach. "I rescued two people." Lydia swallowed. For a moment emotion tightened painfully in her chest. James had died 6 months ago in a mining collapse outside Red Creek. Since then, every conversation about the child had been practical, distant, calculating. The Foster family spoke of inheritance, of responsibility, of the proper raising of the heir. No one had spoken of the baby as a person, except this man. Henrik noticed the tears she tried to hide and looked away immediately, giving her privacy. Silence returned. Hours passed. By the time the wagon rolled into the small trading outpost near dusk, Lydia was exhausted. Henrik helped her down carefully, his hand steady at her waist. Inside the wooden inn, lantern light glowed warmly against rough timber walls. A few travelers turned to stare at the dust-covered newcomers. The innkeeper, a stout middle-aged woman, took one look at Lydia's condition and hurried forward. "Good heavens." Henrik spoke first. "2 rooms," he said calmly. "Hot water, clean bedding." His accent sharpened slightly when he gave instructions, as though command came naturally to him. "And a midwife," he added, immediately. The woman's brows rose. "A midwife will cost extra." Henrik reached into his coat and placed several gold coins upon the counter. "Send for the best one." No one argued after that. Lydia sat slowly upon the narrow bed in the small upstairs room. The pain in her body had dulled, but her hands still trembled. Henrik remained near the door as though careful not to invade her space. For a moment neither spoke. Finally Lydia looked up. "Why are you helping me?" Henrik seemed genuinely surprised by the question. "Because you needed help." "That is not reason enough for most men," she replied quietly. His jaw tightened faintly. "No," he admitted. He stepped closer to the window, looking out at the fading light beyond the dusty street. Most men calculate advantage. His gaze drifted back to her. "I prefer simpler decisions." Lydia studied him. "You are not American." "No." "Where are you from?" "Denmark." The word carried weight, not pride, burden. Before Lydia could ask more, a knock sounded at the door. The midwife had arrived. Henrik waited in the hallway. Minutes passed. Then nearly an hour. Lars leaned against the wall nearby, arms crossed. "You should rest, sir," he muttered quietly in Danish. Henrik did not move. At last the door opened. The midwife stepped out, wiping her hands. "She is fortunate," the woman said. "The child is strong." Henrik's shoulders loosened for the first time since the wreck. "But," the midwife continued, "she must not travel for several days." "How many?" 3, perhaps 4. Henrik nodded immediately. "We will stay." Lars gave him a sharp glance. "The ship leaves for Europe in 3 weeks." Henrik's gaze drifted toward the closed door behind which Lydia rested. "That is enough time." But something in his voice suggested the calculation was not nearly so simple. The following morning, Lydia woke to find sunlight spilling across the floor. Henrik knocked softly before entering. He carried a tray with tea and bread. "You should eat," he said. She accepted the cup with unsteady fingers. "You have done more than enough already." Henrik sat in the wooden chair across from the bed. For several moments he said nothing. Then he asked quietly, "Where were you traveling, Mrs. Foster?" "San Francisco," Lydia replied. "And after that?" "A ship to Boston." Henrik nodded slowly. "Family?" "My aunt." "And the child's father?" The question came gently. Lydia looked down at her hands. "My husband died 6 months ago." Henrik's expression did not change, but something darker passed through his eyes. "And his family." Her voice hardened. "They believe the baby belongs to them." Henrik leaned back in his chair. He understood that tone. He had heard it before, in men and women trapped by expectations they never chose. "They are wrong," he said simply. Lydia looked up. "You do not know me." Henrik's gaze fell briefly to the place where her hand rested over the child. "That is not required." The words were quiet, but absolute. For the first time since the accident, Lydia felt something unfamiliar stir beneath her fear. Not safety, something far more dangerous. Trust. On the third morning, Lydia woke to the strange sensation of quiet. Not the lonely quiet she had known since James died. A different kind, the kind that comes when someone is nearby. She sat slowly at the edge of the bed and looked toward the window. Sunlight spilled through the thin curtains, turning the dust in the air gold. For several seconds she listened. Footsteps moved in the hallway outside, measured, unhurried.
Henrik!
She recognized them now, and for reasons she did not care to examine too closely. Her shoulders relaxed. A knock sounded shortly after. "Come in," she called softly. Henrik entered carrying tea as he had done each morning since the accident. He set the tray on the table beside the bed. "You slept," he observed. "Yes." "That is good." His eyes drifted toward her stomach with the same careful attention he always showed, as though the child had become a quiet responsibility in his mind. "The midwife will come again today," he added. "She will decide whether you may travel." Lydia nodded. She watched him for a moment. "You have been very patient." Henrik raised a brow. "With what?" "With a woman who is not your concern." His gaze lingered on her for a moment before he answered. "You concern me." The words came so simply Lydia did not know how to respond. So she changed the subject. "You said you were traveling to San Francisco as well." "Yes." "For business?" Henrik hesitated. "For departure." "To Europe?" He inclined his head. "My ship leaves in less than 3 weeks." Lydia lowered her eyes. "So once I recover, we part ways." Henrik did not immediately answer. Outside the window, a wagon rattled past the inn. Finally, he said quietly, "Yes." The word landed between them heavier than either expected. Later that afternoon, the midwife returned. After a careful examination, she straightened with a satisfied nod. "The child is strong," she said, "and the mother as well." Lydia released the breath she had been holding. "But she must travel slowly," the woman added, pointing firmly at Henrik as if he were personally responsible. "No rough riding, frequent stops." Henrik nodded. "That will be arranged." The midwife left shortly after. The room fell silent again. Lydia swung her legs carefully over the side of the bed. "I should thank you properly," she said. Henrik looked confused. "For what?" "For refusing to leave me on that hill." A faint shadow crossed his face. "I did not refuse," he replied. "I simply never considered the alternative." Lydia smiled faintly. "You say that as if it were obvious." "To me it was." Their eyes met. Something shifted in the space between them, small, uncertain, impossible to name. Henrik stood abruptly. "We should leave tomorrow," he said. "The road will be easier if we begin early." Lydia nodded, but when he reached the door, she spoke again. "Henrik." He paused. "Yes?" "If you had not been there." Her voice faltered. "I think my child and I would have died." Henrik did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked at her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "I know." The quiet certainty in his voice startled her. Then he added something that unsettled her even more. "And I would not have allowed that." Lydia blinked. "Allowed?" Henrik gave a faint, almost embarrassed smile. "Yes." He opened the door, but before stepping out he glanced back once more, as if realizing something he had not intended to reveal. Then he left. Lydia sat very still for a long time after the door closed, because for the first time since the wreck a new thought had appeared, one far more dangerous than fear. What would happen when the road ended in San Francisco, and Henrik Lowen sailed back across the ocean? The road to San Francisco stretched long and dry beneath the autumn sun. Henrik rode beside the wagon most of the morning, allowing the horses to move slowly so the journey would not strain Lydia. Inside the wagon, she rested against a bundle of blankets, watching the hills pass by in quiet thought. Occasionally, Henrik would glance back to check on her. He never asked if she was comfortable. He simply adjusted things before she had time to complain. Once he stopped the wagon entirely, just to add another folded coat beneath her back. "You worry too much," Lydia said faintly. Henrik did not look at her as he secured the strap. "I prefer preparation to regret." The words sounded heavier than the moment required. She noticed, but she said nothing. They stopped that evening beside a small cluster of trees near the road. Lars built a fire while Henrik prepared the blankets. The sky deepened slowly into a velvet blue filled with distant stars. For a while the three travelers shared a quiet meal of bread and dried meat. Then Lars politely excused himself to check the horses. Lydia and Henrik remained beside the fire. Flames flickered softly between them. "You never told me why you were in California," Lydia said after a while. Henrik stared into the fire. "My uncle sent me." "For business?" "For obedience." Lydia frowned slightly. Henrik sighed. "I am the heir to a duchy in Denmark." The words landed like a stone dropped into still water. Lydia blinked. "A duchy?" Henrik nodded once. "My father died when I was young. My uncle governs until I return to take my place." She studied him in silence. "You do not sound eager." "I am not." The fire popped softly. "Why not?" she asked gently. Henrik hesitated. Then he spoke quietly. "Because the life waiting for me there is already decided." Lydia tilted her head. "Decided how?" Henrik's jaw tightened. "Marriage." The word hung in the night air. "An arrangement made when I was 19, he continued. "A political alliance between families." Lydia lowered her eyes. "And you must return for it." "Yes." He said nothing more. But Lydia could feel the truth behind the single word. Duty, expectation, a life built entirely on obligation. She placed her hand slowly over her stomach. "I understand more than you think." Henrik glanced at her. "My husband was not a cruel man," she said softly, "but my family needed security, so I married him." She gave a faint, sad smile. "Sometimes life chooses for us long before we understand the cost." Henrik watched the fire silently. After a moment, he asked quietly, "And what do you want, Lydia?" The question surprised her. No one had asked her that in years. She looked down at her belly where the baby stirred gently beneath her palm. "I want my child to grow up knowing he was loved," she whispered. "From the very beginning." Henrik held her gaze across the fire. "He will." The certainty in his voice startled her. "How do you know?" Henrik nodded toward her hands. "Because of how you hold him." Lydia felt heat rise behind her eyes. She quickly looked away. The fire crackled between them. Neither spoke for several minutes. Then Henrik reached into his coat pocket and removed a folded piece of paper. He stared at it briefly before slipping it back inside again. Lydia noticed. "What is it?" "A reminder," he said. "Of what?" Henrik's eyes lifted slowly to the horizon where darkness swallowed the distant hills. "That my time here is almost over." Lydia's heart tightened. For the first time since the accident, the truth felt unavoidable. San Francisco was drawing closer with every mile, and when they reached it, Henrik Lowen would return to the life waiting for him across the ocean. San Francisco appeared through the morning fog like a city still deciding what it wished to become. Ships crowded the harbor. Masts cut sharp lines against the pale sky, while wagons and merchants filled the muddy streets with restless noise. Henrik guided the wagon carefully through the chaos until they reached a modest boarding house near the quieter end of the port. The landlady, a broad-shouldered woman with practical eyes, took one look at Lydia's condition and immediately ushered them inside. "A pregnant widow on the road this far along," she muttered. "That's bravery or foolishness." Perhaps both," Lydia answered softly. Henrik arranged 2 rooms without hesitation. When the landlady named her price, he paid for several weeks in advance. Lydia noticed. "You should not spend so much," she said once they were alone in her room. Henrik stood near the window. "It is not charity." "Then what is it?" He hesitated. "Prudence." Lydia understood the unspoken truth. He was preparing to leave. The following days passed quietly. The midwife visited often, insisting Lydia walk slowly in the courtyard each afternoon to keep her strength. Henrik always appeared nearby. Sometimes he walked beside her. Sometimes he remained a few steps behind, as if pretending he was there for another reason. They spoke of small things: the cold winters of Denmark, the gold mines of California, stories of ships, markets, and distant towns. But beneath those gentle conversations something else lingered, something neither of them dared touch. One evening, Lydia sat beneath the courtyard tree, sewing a small piece of cloth that would become the baby's first blanket. Henrik sat across from her reading a newspaper he had not turned for several minutes. "You are not reading," she observed. Henrik lowered the paper. "No." "Then what are you doing?" He studied her carefully. "Thinking." "About Denmark?" "Yes." And about leaving?" The silence between them stretched. Finally Henrik nodded. "Yes." Lydia placed the sewing in her lap. Her voice was calm. "Then perhaps you should go sooner." Henrik's head lifted sharply. "You wish that?" "No," she admitted. "But wishing changes nothing." Her honesty struck him harder than anger would have. Henrik stood and paced a few steps before stopping beside the tree. "You believe I leave because it is easy? I believe you leave because you must." He looked down at her. Duty is not always the same as choice. Lydia's hand rested protectively on her stomach. "No," she said quietly, "but sometimes refusing duty destroys more lives than it saves." Henrik stared at her. For a moment the calm mask he wore cracked. "And if duty destroys the life you actually want?" Lydia's breath caught. The words hung between them, dangerous, unfinished. She rose slowly from the bench. "You should not ask me that question," she whispered. "Why?" "Because I would answer honestly." Henrik stepped closer without thinking. "How?" Lydia's voice trembled despite her effort to remain composed. "I would tell you that some choices break your heart either way." Their eyes locked. The air between them seemed suddenly fragile. Henrik lifted his hand almost without realizing it. His fingers brushed lightly against her cheek. The touch was hesitant, reverent. "Lydia," he murmured, her eyes filled with tears. "You must not look at me that way," she whispered. Henrik frowned. "Why?" "Because you are leaving." The truth struck them both with painful clarity. For a moment neither moved. Then Lydia stepped back. Her voice was steadier now. "You should go back to Denmark, Henrik." "And you?" She forced a small smile. "I will raise my child." Henrik's hand slowly fell to his side. The quiet promise in her words hurt more than any accusation, because it meant she had already begun preparing herself for the moment he would walk away. The morning of Henrik's departure arrived beneath a sky the color of pale steel. San Francisco's harbor stirred early. Sailors shouted across the docks while ropes creaked and gulls circled overhead. Inside the boarding house, Lydia stood beside the window of her small room, watching the fog lift slowly from the water. She had not slept. Every sound in the corridor had kept her awake. Every passing footstep had made her wonder if it was his. A soft knock finally came. Her breath caught. "Come in," she said quietly. Henrik stepped inside. He looked different. The dark travel coat he wore was clean again, brushed carefully as if preparing for a formal journey rather than a simple voyage. For a moment neither of them spoke. The silence carried too many things they had not said. "I leave within the hour," Henrik said at last. Lydia nodded. "I know." He studied her face carefully, noticing the faint shadows beneath her eyes. "You should still be resting." "I will rest after you are gone," she replied. Henrik looked down briefly. The words felt heavier than she intended. "I came to say goodbye," he said. Lydia forced a small smile. "Then you should not linger. Ships are known for leaving without passengers." Henrik did not smile in return. Instead, he stepped closer. "There are arrangements I have made." She sighed softly. "You mean the money you left with the landlady?" "And the lawyer," Henrik added. "He will represent you if your husband's family attempts to claim the child." Lydia stiffened slightly. "You thought of everything." "I tried." The word carried quiet frustration, because there was one thing he had not solved. He could not stay. Lydia turned away from him, walking slowly toward the bed. "You should not worry about us," she said gently. Henrik's voice sharpened. "I will always worry." The words slipped out before he could stop them. She froze. For a moment neither moved. Then Lydia turned back slowly. "You cannot," she said. "Why not?" "Because you are not part of our lives." Henrik stared at her. "That is not entirely true." Lydia's eyes glistened. "You saved us. I will always be grateful." "That is not what I meant." Silence filled the room. Henrik took another step closer, close enough now that he could see the faint tremble in her hands. "Lydia," he said quietly, "you are not nothing to me." The words landed like a sudden storm. Her breath caught. For several seconds she could not speak. Then tears slipped down her cheeks despite her effort to stop them. Henrik lifted his hand gently and turned her face back toward him. The gesture was careful, almost reverent. "Do not cry," he murmured. You are making this very difficult. Lydia gave a small broken laugh. It was already difficult. Henrik lowered his hand slowly. His voice dropped. I did not expect to find someone here who would matter. And yet you did. Yes. The admission hung between them. Painful. Unavoidable. Lydia drew a slow breath. Then go, she whispered. Henrik frowned. What? Go back to Denmark, face whatever waits for you there. Her voice strengthened. Do not stay here because of me. Henrik clenched his jaw. You believe it would be that simple? No, she said softly. But I believe it would be wrong. He looked at her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. You are right. The agreement felt like a knife. Henrik stepped toward the door. At the threshold he paused. Without turning, he said quietly, If one day I am free to choose my own life. Lydia's heart pounded. I will come back. Her voice trembled. And if I am no longer here? Henrik finally turned. Then I will search until I find you. For a moment the world seemed to stop. Then he bowed his head slightly and walked out of the room. The door closed behind him with a soft click. Lydia sank slowly onto the bed, one hand covering her mouth as silent tears fell, because she had just watched the only man who had made her feel safe in months walk away. And she had told him to go. The ship left San Francisco just before noon. Fog rolled slowly across the harbor, blurring the distant shoreline as the great vessel eased away from the dock. Henrik stood at the rail. His posture was as straight and composed as ever, yet his gaze remained fixed on the city slowly fading behind him. Lars stood nearby in silence. Neither man spoke, because both knew the truth. Henrik had not left California willingly. Lydia watched the ship from the far end of the pier. She had told herself she would not come, that watching him leave would only make the pain sharper. Yet when the morning arrived, her feet had carried her there before her mind could argue. She stood hidden among crates and cargo wagons, one hand resting protectively over the gentle curve of her stomach. Henrik never saw her, not as the ship pulled away, not as the sails filled with wind, not as the distance between them widened across the gray water. Only when the vessel finally disappeared into the mist did Lydia whisper softly to the child she carried, He has gone back to his life. The baby shifted faintly beneath her palm. And now, she added quietly, we must build ours. Weeks passed. Life in San Francisco settled into a fragile rhythm. Lydia remained at the boarding house, helping with sewing and small household tasks in exchange for reduced rent. The lawyer Henrik had hired, Mr. Campbell, visited occasionally, ensuring everything remained quiet. But quiet never lasted long. One afternoon he arrived with grave news. The Foster family has begun searching for you, he told her. They intend to claim custody once the child is born. Lydia felt the blood drain from her face. Can they do that? They will try. Her hands tightened protectively over her stomach. Then I will fight. Campbell studied her carefully. You may need someone beside you. Lydia's voice remained steady. I already have someone. She looked down at the child. My son. Months later, the baby arrived on a stormy winter night. The boarding house echoed with thunder while the midwife worked tirelessly beside the bed. At dawn, a strong cry filled the room. A boy, the midwife announced. Lydia held him close, tears sliding freely down her cheeks. You are safe, she whispered. I promise you will always be safe. She named him Thomas. But peace did not last. 2 months later, the Foster family representatives arrived in San Francisco with lawyers and legal documents. They demanded custody. The court hearing was scheduled within weeks. Lydia stood before the magistrate alone. Her hands trembled, but her voice did not. Why should this child remain with you? The judge asked. She answered simply, because I am his mother. The room fell silent. Then suddenly the courtroom doors opened. A murmur swept through the crowd. A tall man entered wearing a travel coat still dusted with sea salt.
Henrik!
He walked directly to Lydia's side. Her breath stopped. You came back, she whispered. I told you I would. He turned toward the magistrate. My name is Henrik Lowen, he said calmly. And I wish to speak on behalf of Mrs. Lydia Foster. The Foster lawyer scoffed. You are nothing to this child. Henrik nodded. That is true. Then he looked at Lydia and spoke the words that changed everything. Which is why I intend to marry his mother. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Henrik's voice remained steady, not to win a case. His eyes softened slightly as he looked at Lydia, but because I choose her. The decision tipped the balance. Weeks later, the court ruled in Lydia's favor. Thomas would remain with his mother. 6 months later, the small house on the edge of San Francisco smelled of bread and sea air. Laundry fluttered in the yard. Thomas laughed loudly from the grass while Lydia chased him gently. Henrik sat nearby, attempting, with little success, to build a wooden playpen.
You're doing that wrong, Lydia said, amused.
Henrik looked up indignantly. I was trained to manage estates. And yet you cannot hammer a straight nail. Thomas clapped happily between them. Henrik smiled then, a real smile, the kind he had never worn in Denmark. He looked around the modest yard, at Lydia, at the child who had wrapped his small fingers around Henrik's thumb. And he knew. He had not lost a dukedom. He had found a life. Later that night, Lydia asked softly, "Do you ever miss Denmark?" Henrik thought for a moment. Sometimes. She studied him carefully. "If you ever wish to return." He shook his head gently. "I already came home." His gaze rested on her, and Lydia understood. Sometimes love does not arrive in ballrooms or grand estates. Sometimes it begins in wreckage. Sometimes it crosses oceans. And sometimes the greatest promise a man can make is simply this: "I chose you.